Hey guys, what's up? Public here back with another video, and today we're talking about the class tree. Specifically, going over Dragonflight, was the class tree available for priests considered a success or not? So I want to talk about the good things, the bad things, and also what can be improved going into the next expansion. I think a lot of potential here in this tree, but I think there's a lot of issues I like to kind of bring up and hopefully get addressed as we move forward. So let's dive in. Okay, so overall, I think, especially if you've played lots of classes in Dragonflight, in my opinion, I think the priest tree is among the best. And there's a couple reasons for that. Not to say that it's perfect, but I do think there's a lot going on here that I think we do want to comment as being good. And really kind of just starting off, I think the class tree is supposed to strike a balance of, I think, utility options and as much non-throughput as possible. Although I think, obviously, even in this tree, there are some glaring problems or things we'll point out with that philosophy. But I think if you remove all the throughput options from the class tree, I actually think on its own it can actually stand up pretty well. Even though some of the choices can be somewhat clunky in terms of like where they are and what you're giving up for certain things. But on paper, you're swapping out. Okay, first up, get all of the throughput options that you need on the tree. You can see there's quite a lot of things on here that you'll always take. Things like Death and Madness, Power Infusion, Twist of Fate, Throes of Pain. So you get all your kind of baseline throughput, which I think, looking at all the class trees, priest from a DPS perspective is somewhat relatively low on that scale. Once you get all your throughput stuff, then you're basically saying, okay, what utility do I need for the content that I'm currently doing? And this is where I think our tree really shines. And I think maybe just because historically priest has had quite a lot of utility to pick from, there's just a lot of options on our tree. Not to list off all of them, but we have Dispel Magic, we have Purified Disease, Shackle Undead, even though that's kind of niche. And even things like Dominate Mind, although also somewhat niche, Mass Dispel, although somewhat controversial and recently nerfed. But there's a lot of stuff on here that's like, okay, I can see, especially in Mythic Plus, some things make more sense than others. There's also, depending on the affixes or whatever, certain things get picked more so than others. There's also like things like Phantasm, which again, so a lot of this is like single things that are very like, oh, in this particular affix, it's really nice. So you can, you pick up a lot of those things that are really useful, and then from there, you're basically maximizing how much defensive points you can take. Generally speaking, our tree has more defensive nodes than we can take all. Like, we can't take all of them. You can have to pick and choose which defensive points you want. We kind of have like a hierarchy of the ones that we pick. And I think for the most part, that's a pretty healthy choice or healthy place to be in. Although I think it could be reined in a little bit. So just to get into more specifics of the utility points, again, that we already mentioned, I think there's quite a lot that are quite strong here, and I think that's a good thing. I think it's also good that some of them are somewhat contentious, so you can't just, if you decide to pick every single utility point, well, that means you're going to have to sacrifice usually defensive value to pick up some of those things. So that's kind of the balance in the tree, which I think is overall pretty healthy from a gameplay perspective. And again, I think compared to other specs, I think in classes, this is done relatively well. Although I do think, some of these, could be maybe improved to be a little less niche and more universally valuable. Because I think right now, the tree is somewhat standing up on a lot of the affixes in Mythic Plus, kind of doing well with like Shackle Undead, for example, does really well with Incorporeal, or Phantasm does really well with Entangling. But outside of those use cases, you almost never take those talents. Unless there's like a very specific raid mechanic or something that would require that. So I think some of those you could say, okay, maybe we should increase kind of the diversity of some of those points, which would be nice. But overall, I think it's in a relatively healthy state. So kind of moving on from there, let's talk about, what could be improved in this tree and where we go from here. Okay, so what could be improved? This is, I think, where more of the meat and potatoes section of the video comes in. Although there are quite a lot of good things. Like I said, there's some stuff that I think could be improved. The first thing I want to talk about is Mind Control and Dominate Mind. This is something that we basically take all of the time right now, and mostly just from a pathing perspective. Not to say that having locked-in talents is necessarily a problem, but I think when it comes to utility, you want to feel like you're getting something out of that point. And right now we're doing that because we definitely want Throes of Pain, and to get down there, we needed something to get here, which is almost always Vampiric Embrace, which is almost always a great thing to have anyways. But to get down here, you're either picking Dominate Mind or Mind Control, or Sheer Terror and Void Tendrils. We'll talk about those in a bit. So for these two, I think particularly, I love that this is a choice, by the way. I think for the most part, mind control has issues in like a PvE environment, and I think dominate mind is the natural, like, this makes sense using it. The problem with this though is I feel like the class is somewhat, or the spell is overly punished, for lack of foresight, I think, from the developers. Just on, there are some things where in Mythic Plus or in Raid where this does actually work and becomes really valuable and useful, and then almost always gets nerfed into the ground completely, making the talent effectively useless at that point. And a lot of it is like, well, if you care enough, you can cast this every 30 seconds to get like a very small amount of benefit, but it's almost always not worth the hassle due to like weird threat issues, having to recast it so often, and just the value you get from doing it being so low. Typically early on in a PvE season, you'll see this get used quite a lot. People will find like tech, but as the season goes on, all of those things eventually get nerfed if they are that strong to begin with. So I think overall, I think this could be improved in the sense of, if it's going to be a talent, especially where it is on the pathing perspective, in the sense that we're taking it so often, I wish they were more clear about why and when you would want this to work. It just feels so niche right now with how much they've nerfed things into the ground, and again, maybe that's just hard to move this in a direction that's like healthy for the game, because there have been, game breaking things that came up with this. I know there was one thing that's now been patched in the recent raid of Mirdrasil. There's a trash mob you can dominate mine that was just doing like stacking infinite dot damage onto raid bosses, which would just give you like a rank 1 parse on everything. So like obviously there are things that need to get toned down. Like that's not good. But I think there's currently no middle ground where this feels fun and exciting and worthwhile to press, and I think it could be better. Next thing to bring up is overall off healing available from a Shadow Priest perspective, which is what this video is kind of aimed at. I think you're pretty much not going to take off healing stuff. I've actually been experimenting with this recently inside of Mythic Plus from like a downtime perspective. If we're like running in between packs and I can't mount, I'll throw out a Prayer of Mending or a couple renews, and it does something. I don't do it very often, but it's like, I don't know, it's pretty insignificant from a healing perspective. One of the reasons I was playing around with this, and I do still use it from time to time, is to proc Twist of Fate, specifically the healing component. But the kind of struggle with that is it's doing so little from a healing perspective, and I'm pretty disincentivized to press it because it's not really doing anything else for me outside of that Twist of Fate benefit. Like one common thing we've talked about is giving or adding these spells into hallucinations. If you're not aware of what that is, there's a Shadow Priest passive called Hallucinations. Your successful dispels, disease dispels, power word shield cast generate 4 insanity during combat. So that was actually originally a thing, so you didn't feel like bad using utility spells during our ramps with like Surrender to Madness and Void Form days. But they left it in. I think it's still worthwhile, and I do wish off healing maybe could get added to that, or at least feel like we could spec into it more, even if it's like a slight damage loss. If I want to go into more off healing and have it actually be worthwhile to press some of this stuff, I think that'd be good. Right now, the numbers on these, or the coefficients on these spells, at least from a shadow perspective, combined with the fact that they don't generate insanity, just makes it just not worth using, or you basically just don't consider talenting into anything on these far left side almost always for that reason. And I think that's kind of a shame. I think in order for the class tree, I think, to be considered a complete success from a hybrid spec perspective, I would want to have that be somewhat of a pull as a Shadow Priest, or at least as an option to say like, ooh, I could drop some utility or something to get more of that kind of off healing mentality. Especially if it's going to be there on the tree. I think having throughput here at all is somewhat questionable, but if it's going to be there, at least let it be, an option as a DPS priest. So there's that guy. Moving on to the next bit to talk about that, again, could be improved, is movement. And I specifically bring this up, one, because I think the spec and the class overall is lacking good movement options, and because there are currently 2 on our class tree, with Angelic Feather and Body and Soul. I think most Shadow Priests almost always are taking both of these options, just to have like a bunch of sustained movement, because the spec is somewhat slow. We don't have any displacement abilities, and even these as movement abilities are quite minor. There's no blinking, stuff like that. Especially at the loss after moving on from Shadowlands, losing access to Soul Shaper and Door of Shadows, has kind of added the kind of glaring issues we've seen with the class's ability to handle movement. Also, like, funnily enough, it kind of plays into the Evoker buff, class buff, gives you a reduced cooldown of Leap of Faith and extra access to Leap of Faith, which is kind of funny because it's not really a movement ability for us. So I think it's fair to bring this up and to say that we do have two movement abilities on the tree that are both doing the same thing, more or less. They're just giving you, it's kind of like better for sustained movement, but it's like pretty minor sustained movement, and there's nothing that lets us displace our movement quickly or that feels like a movement cooldown, more or less. Angelic Feather obviously is somewhat niche, and you could give it to someone else, although I think most priests just have this macro to put it at their feet. So yeah, I think this choice just feels like it could be better. Maybe instead of having both options, you condense it down to one option that's a bit more powerful, and then give it a choice node versus some displacement option. I think the suggestion I've thrown around, and others as well, has to put Door of Shadows in here, which is currently sitting unused in the game currently, and that's mostly just because of the Covenant abilities that we did have from Shadowlands that got poured over. They did bring Mind Games over, so it kind of fits that theme. I don't know, or like some kind of priest displacement ability that we've had in the past. The other one that's been thrown around is canonically Reverse Leap of Faith, or Vault of the Heavens, which was a legendary in Shadowlands, which changes Leap of Faith to be, instead of you pulling an ally, you vault yourself towards an ally instead. So I think something like that, and I think improving the movement choices on the tree will go a long way to making it feel better, both for the class of play and the tree overall. Moving on, next thing to cover is Mass Dispel. So this was nerfed pretty heavily towards the end of Season 2 going into Season 3, and I think somewhat this was a knee-jerk reaction to, at the time, a dungeon pool that was heavily benefiting from Mass Dispel being as strong as it was. At the time, it was a relatively short cooldown, and there were effects in almost every single dungeon where they just put like some magic ability on the entire group that was, getting to Mass Dispel it off was just extremely powerful. Comparing that to something like Revival, which is a 2-minute cooldown, or other mechanics in the game, it was just very superior when you had a priest. So I think notably, though, this was not a problem for basically any other season in Mythic Plus, more or less. There were some instances where, like, bursting weeks as the affix would obviously lend towards Mass Dispel being strong, but outside of that, that was all it was kind of really shining for. And I bring that up just because I think this was more of a dungeon pool issue of Season 2 and less of a problem of Mass Dispel itself. So to say that Mass Dispel wasn't necessarily too strong, but there was just too many mechanics that could be countered by Mass Dispel in that season's dungeon pool. And if we look at the current season, Season 3, there is much less available where, like, Mass Dispel is inherently useful. Even if it was back to its old cooldown, I don't think you'd suddenly start seeing a bunch more priests. So yeah, I think this in general, they need to pick what they want to do with this spell. They basically increased the cooldown and didn't do anything else with it. So I think if it's going to be a 2-minute cooldown, I'd like it for it to, maybe affect more than 5 targets to make it more worthwhile in raiding. That still doesn't quite solve its use cases in dungeons. So maybe changing that for dungeon use cases. But again, I think this is more of balancing utility inside of dungeons rather than, nerfing the base spell itself. Let's balance dungeons and those kind of things before that. So yeah, I think just in general, it could be improved. I think there's lots of different ways to do it, but overall, this just doesn't feel great today, and just, kind of harks on to, like, why is this spell here? It's like so much worse than Revival is, and it's just very niche use cases now, and it's like a 2-minute cooldown. So, and it's a cast. It's just like, man, this is just pretty feels bad. So. And the last thing on my list of things that I think could be improved from the class tree is Divine Star and Halo. I will say, like, generically, of the things on our kit that are throughput in this tree, I think this is probably the thing that I think has the most potential. Obviously, we have things like Shadow Fiend, the Shadow or Death talents, which are fine. Although, we'll get to that in the kind of bad section. But I think these are somewhat iconic if you've ever played a priest historically. So them coming back was kind of refreshing to see. Although I think the spot that they're in is somewhat lackluster, and I wish it was a little better than what it is currently. I think they kind of struggled with they didn't want to make these spells feel like super rotationally important, so they don't do a ton of damage or, throughput. Where they do kind of shine more than anything is just off healing or giving you something to press when all you're doing is hard casting things like Mind Spike or Mind Flay. I think in general, the spec already has a lot of buttons though, so it doesn't feel like it's great at accomplishing that goal. So I do think, given the choice, it's more or less, if you put this up against other things in our kit, so the best comparison is Mind Games. It's also in the class tree. I do think these spells are generically more useful than Mind Games is. So I kind of wish they were developed more, or maybe instead of Mind Games. So if you can picture, just removing these Mind Games talents altogether, which there are currently 4 points here, and maybe developing Divine Star and Halo to be more, just powerful abilities. Maybe that's kind of the core part of the class tree. That could make sense. Not quite sure what that would look like. I think it would also be cool if they baked in a triple choice node, which is not something I think the game currently supports, but it would be cool if we did get the classic Cascade Divine Star Halo choice just as a thematic thing. It'd be fun. But yeah, I think this could be developed a bit more. I think many players look at this double thing, this choice node, as button bloat. And I think the players that are used to playing the spec recognize that it is actually really decent at like off healing. If I look at this last Mythic plus Keystone, although I didn't cast Divine Star that many times, it still did, 2.4 million healing over the course of the key, which is pretty good considering I'm not casting it a whole bunch, pretty much when I have nothing else to do. And then from like a damage perspective on overall, again, this is inside of Mythic Plus. It only did 2% of my damage. Again, just a super low priority spell. Not something you press unless it's like mass AoE. So yeah, I think it's tuning wise in a healthy spot from a damage perspective. I just wish if it was going to take up a keybind, it felt a little more impactful, especially as somewhat a core choice node in the class tree. So that is what I think could be improved. Let's move on to the ugly side of the tree, or the things that I think really need to be looked at. Okay, so covering the bad side of the tree. To not say the tree is definitely not perfect. There's lots of kind of, I think, glaring sore spots in the tree that, desperately need to be addressed. Going into the next expansion, it's kind of a reset button. Especially, I think, now that we've played with this for a whole expansion without seeing a whole lot of changes, I'm looking forward to hopefully addressing a lot of these guys. So the main thing for me that I think is, this is like the least priority, but I do think it's somewhat disappointing how many things on this are locked in points. I think when the tree feels good, you want to kind of minimize how many points on the tree are locked in from the class tree perspective, and really kind of rein in more choices that feel fun. There's currently quite a lot on here that feel locked in as a Shadow Priest that I think maybe is a few points too many, and maybe some of these could just be made baseline instead. I do note that this is a delicate problem because they have to balance this with Disc and Holy as well. But I do think making some of these baseline or just getting rid of them could make way for adding other things onto the class tree that would make it feel more exciting, like bringing Shining Force back, putting an interrupt in the class tree, things like that. And we need some room on the tree to make that work. So right now we're always taking Death and Madness and Tithe Evasion. So these are the first ones I'm going to bring up. I think just in general, as a Shadow Priest, if you're pressing Shadow or Death, this is always going to be taken. Like I said, we don't have a whole lot of throughput here, so you're always going to take these, which, I don't know, it just feels kind of weird that you're getting Shadow or Death like baseline and Shadow Fiend baseline, but there's just so few points on this tree that interact with it at all. It doesn't really make sense why it's up here to begin with. So yeah, it just feels weird, and I think Tithe Evasion especially so. Like, after the recent rework of how it's dealing damage, this is still relevant, especially if you end up taking certain things in the spec tree. So I don't know, this just feels not great to me, and I think it could be overall improved upon, especially if it's something that Disc is also pressing as well. I think they could do a lot more with the kind of Shadow or Death section of the tree, if it's going to be there at all from a throughput perspective. Other ones is also Power Infusion and Twins of the Sun Priestess. You just always take this. There's never a reason you don't take this, which I think they knew that, which is why they put it so central on the tree. I just kind of wonder, if you're always going to take it, does it really make that sense? It does restrict your pathing to some degree because you always need to have this. I don't know, it just makes for a less exciting tree, in my opinion, when you see literally every priest in every situation taking these. Just feels a little lackluster. And then as a Shadow Priest, again, locked in points you always take is Twist of Fate and Throes of Pain. You see they definitely want us to gravitate towards that bottom right section of the tree, so this does somewhat make sense, but both of these are things that I think players, especially those of pain, just kind of forget even exist and just kind of take for granted. So I do kind of wish things were shaped up a little bit, especially because the counter to getting into this bottom section, Unwavering Will, is so terrible for Shadow. I don't know, I just feel like these gates could be revisited. Not that I want to get rid of the spells, but just kind of where they are and kind of whether or not they should be baseline just feels kind of weird, especially with, I don't know, how minimal some of them feel sometimes. And then the last thing to really bring up from a locked-in perspective is mind games, especially the base point. You can see in the tree that I'm currently running, I'm actually not running these last 2 points here, and that's just because I wanted more utility, and these things are quite minor. I think for a 4-point investment in the class tree, you're getting so little from this. In mass AoE, like, you'd be lucky to get 2% damage out of these last 4 spells. It's usually in the 1 to 1.5% range, and it's just so minor as a button in PvE, especially. I don't like that it's taking up this much real estate on the tree, and I think could absolutely be better, especially because, at least as of posting this video, Holy and Disc have almost no reason to take this at all. They just don't recommend taking it in most default builds anymore. It just doesn't hit hard enough. It doesn't have enough kind of oomph in the spell itself. I will recognize that the reversal component of the spell is heavily underused inside of PvE, although it does have those niche use cases in PvP. I think for the overall health of the game and the spec and the class, I think this just needs to be better. If a spell is only ever used inside of PvP or only ever used inside of PvE, I think that's ultimately a spot where things could be better and could be improved. And I think if you're going to have mind games here, let's have it be a button worth key binding, whereas today it just feels kind of meh to press. So yeah, I think this could do with kind of revisiting or changing up how this works. And then the last section to cover is all of the things in the class tree that are just not currently used today. I think going over the course of an expansion, the things on this list have been used extremely niche use cases, or seldom if at any. And I think that calls for revisiting. If at least even just one spec isn't using these at all, things could be revisited. So I won't cover too much, but I will just note that, similar to the point I brought up earlier, there is a lot of off-healing stuff that just doesn't make sense as a Shadow Priest. Even if you went full off-healing and picked all of the healing nodes in the tree, you wouldn't be doing significant off-healing. So that's just a massive opportunity right there, in my opinion. Either remove the throughput choices completely, or if they're going to be there, at least have there be some pull as a Shadow Priest to pick them over our current options. The next thing to talk about that I brought up a little bit earlier is the choice node of Sheer Terror and Void Tendrils. These spells just need help. I think they even buff Sheer Terror at some point, but this just never gets picked. It's just so niche when this is the thing. In group content, Sheer Terror just has no use cases at all. The number would need to be like 750% to start getting somewhere, I think, where this is useful. It's just, there's so much damage happening that Sheer Terror will just never make sense. I think Psychic Stream is a great utility button as like a mass AoE stop, something that the spec desperately loves having. I wish it was still Mind Bomb or still kind of a ranged version of it, but that's okay. I think Sheer Terror just isn't it and just needs revisiting. And similarly on this choice node, Void Tendrils is just not good enough either. They did change it to root all enemies within 8 yards for 20 seconds. But the problem is this, again, breaking on damage so quickly, you're just not getting enough value out of this and for it to be valuable, especially because, similar to Psychic Scream, you have to run in melee for this. So if you have aggro on anything, it's just instantly much, much worse because you're putting yourself in danger to get in there. If it was cast at range or maybe altered a little bit, maybe you could see it being used more. But as it stands right now, it's just not worth the talent point almost ever. I think there's like a niche use case where I've been using it this expansion with Spiteful Weeks inside of Mythic Plus. But even that, it's pretty dicey. And again, hard to warrant giving up a keybind for this spell. In addition, the next thing to talk about is Apathy. Similar, I think this is going to be very similar to some other things on here. But this is just, again, it's giving Mind Blast crits, reduce the target's movement speed for 4 seconds. in PvE, there's just nothing that would like draw me to this. You can see I'm actually currently taking all 3 things that lead into this, but we don't pick it. Reducing movement speed on like a single mob just in PvE just doesn't have enough oomph. So I just wish this was more, I don't know, something that was worth picking sometimes in PvE. Again, I'm sure this might have niche use cases in PvP, but I think, again, if it's only going to be used in one, I think it could be better. Next up, Angelic Bulwark. I think you'll actually probably see quite a bit of people using this, but it's just not, it doesn't work correctly, is I think the way I would put it. The way it reads is, when attack brings you below 30% health, you gain an absorb shield equal to 15% of your max health for 20 seconds. Can only occur every 90 seconds or every minute and a half. I think on paper that sounds great. It's basically somewhat like a cheat death, but currently it just doesn't work the way that it's worded. It seems to just trigger when it's not supposed to, or what's actually happening almost always is that if you take 30% of your health in a single hit, then it'll proc and trigger, even if you go from like 100 to 70%. And even that isn't super consistent, so the spell just seems somewhat broken. I think if they fix this, maybe it becomes more useful, but I think if you want to put kind of a pseudo cheat death thing in here, especially on a 90-second cooldown, I don't know, I'd almost rather the cooldown be increased and make it a bit more useful. And the bug just needs to get fixed. It's been the whole expansion, and we haven't seen any development on this, so yeah, just needs to get fixed, needs to get changed. Another smaller thing, Move with Grace. This is just a random talent off of Leap of Faith. I think, you know, having some of these nodes on here is okay, but I don't know, just a 30-second cooldown reduction on Leap of Faith is just so niche when the spell is very iconic, but it isn't something that we're pressing every minute, or almost always not needed. So I don't know. I just, maybe this could be changed or made a bit more exciting or enticing. The last thing to bring up, and this is similar to Apathy, I think a lot of players probably don't even know this is on the tree, is a talent called Blessed Recovery. Almost always we're taking spell warding, which I think is quite strong and well, not quite, it's, it's fine. It's just 3%, it's a good point on the tree. It reduces all magic damage taken by 3%, which is not nothing, but it's something. It's actually a choice node with Blessed Recovery, which is after being struck by a melee or ranged critical hit, you heal 20% of the damage taken over 6 seconds. I think in almost all content in PvE, I think at least they've been more or less moving away from enemies being able to crit you in PvE. I think that gameplay just feels too RNG and hard to plan for, so they've just removed that from being a thing. So that's why I was saying, again, this is just not seeing use. So I wish there was more of a choice here of saying, get static magic DR, or a bit, something that is less reliable, but when it does happen is useful. So, but currently today in PvE, this thing just doesn't get used. So hopefully it's something to look at. So, okay, that is the class tree kind of in review. Overall, I think, would you call it a success? I think relative to other trees in the game, I think it's definitely up there. And I'm just looking forward to any and all changes we make going into the next expansion to kind of elevate it to the next level and hopefully make it even more exciting and give us even better choices to add. So let me know what you think, if there's anything I missed, or what you think of the class tree overall, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.